everybody. I'm Carl Wells. My guest today spent 20 years of her life in Zimbabwe, working as a missionary doctor with the Salvation Army. After that, she returned to Newfoundland, and currently she's a physician at the Carbonear Hospital. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Dawn Howse. Hi, Dawn.
Hi, thank you.
First of all, when you were a little girl, what made you decide that you might like to be a doctor?
Well, first I wanted to be a mother. Changed my mind somewhere after 6 brothers. And then I thought maybe teaching or nursing, since they were professions my parents held. But at some point along the way, I think toward my first year of university, I went to one of the university advisors looking at my science background, which I really enjoyed. They suggested medicine. I thought, well, it's a pretty good idea. But I had also been a little bit influenced by looking at church movies at that time of missionaries and missionary service, and thought that that might be something of a good idea too. Put that aside as a fairy tale and wishful thinking, and didn't think a whole lot about it till I got to university age and started looking at career choices.
Now, you actually graduated with your medical degree at the age of 21, which is very early, it seems to me. How did you manage that?
Skipped a grade, sort of, kindergarten and grade 1, but mostly due, I think, to my father's love for reading. He started my brothers reading at probably age 3. I remember reading comics to my grandmother before I went to school. So that was a really big influence on reading, knowledge, learning, love for learning. And skipped that grade. Also, of course, the benefit, we had only grade 11 back when we were children. And went into the pre-meds program, and at 2 years after university, accepted among 7 others into the medical school class of 50. So a little bit of a boost each time. And 78.
Now, you went into general practice.
Yes.
You didn't decide to become, a specialist in any particular area. Mm-hmm. What was it about general practice that interested you?
Well, first I thought pediatrics, but each time I went into a separate field of studies in medical school, I loved every one of them, and thought, well, if you like it all, you might as well do it all, and went into general practice then. And I love the rural area, so that was also a good choice, having a broad background and being able to serve at a primary care level.
Mm-hmm. Now, your first job, doctoring, if you
Yes.
want to put it that way, was on the West Coast in
Mm-hmm.
Woody Point.
Yes.
What was it like being a GP in rural Newfoundland?
Rural was familiar. I grew up in rural areas mostly. The biggest place I ever lived was Gander until university. So that was great. I didn't mind the thought of not knowing anyone in a small community. And rural area, Woody Point, beautiful Bond Bay, really caught hold of me. I thought I'd go check out the possibility of salaried positions rather than start up a business on my own under the MCP system. So I toddled off to the Confederation building and met with the cottage hospital systems people, and they offered me a few areas to choose. So Woody Point was the area that I liked. Really thoroughly enjoyed it, though you were on call pretty much all of the time while you were present in the community. But it was great going through from Woody Point to Trout River a couple of times a week, taking turns in the clinics there, and also taking a turn in Norris Point Cottage Hospital, going across the bay once a month and doing a weekend there to give the 3 physicians a break there. we saw a lot of things. There was once I inadvertently did a delivery on the exam table at the clinic because we couldn't get a chance to get the person to Corner Brook in time.
Right, yeah.
But most of the time it was at a primary care level, and I didn't have a whole lot of evening calls until I'd go for the weekend to Norris Point. But that also at that time involved all areas of care up to maternity delivering, if we thought it safe and feasible, doing normal deliveries in Norris Point.
So then at one point, you decided that you wanted to put all of that aside and go to St. John's and study to become a Salvation Army officer. What brought that about?
Well, I had moved to Corner Brook and decided to do a primary practice, MCP based, and started there. Built up a practice from grassroots by seeing a few people in the emergency department and then taking them on as patients. After 5 years and doing pretty well, I looked around me and thought, well, I'm 30 years old and it's time to either settle down and buy a house in Corner Brook and live there the rest of my life, or listen to what I felt was God's calling and go into what used to be called missionary work, but is now with the Salvation Army called reinforcement officer work. And I felt that I could serve best by also taking in Bible study and theology and working to serve in both spiritual as well as medical terms. And with the intent of Africa, I hoped, in mind.
Is it true that at some point in your life, no doubt when you were younger, you'd seen a movie about Africa, and that stuck with you?
Yes, I believe it did. And one of our family friends, one of our family officers, confirmed that, yes, he remembered showing that movie. So, yes, it did stick. And although I thought it fanciful at the time that anyone could still do that kind of adventurous project, it somehow stuck in my mind enough to make me think that, yes, I'd like to be in that position. The other curious thing was that I also received a letter from Africa, from a woman physician in Harare who was retiring and looking for someone to take her place. I never did take her personal place where she was working, but the first 4 years of my life in Zimbabwe, I was working in the Salvation Army's hospital system near Harare before I went.
And Harare is the capital of Zimbabwe?
It is, yes.
Right. Yep.
And we were just 70 kilometers outside the city before I was then transferred to Chelanyamba, which is south of the country.
But before you actually got on the plane to go to Africa,
yes,
you kind of had to do a pit stop in Liverpool, England.
Yep.
What were you doing in Liverpool, England?
It was a diploma in tropical medicine and hygiene, which of course encompasses a number of the diseases and likely scenarios that you would encounter in Africa or sometimes Middle East or South America, some of the diseases that were more prevalent. We don't encounter much malaria, for example, in Newfoundland, unless people have really been traveling. And we don't encounter some of the issues of water and sanitation because we're generally far removed from it in our private practice and primary practice here. But when I was in Zimbabwe, yes, I had to know a little bit about what we did with our sewage, what we did with our blood products and how to dispose of safely, how to look at things in the way of public health and looking at what in Zimbabwe the children are taught of the 5 killer diseases, for example, and the grandmothers and mothers, the aunties, are used to having the clinics come to them and do immunization schedules, and they'll sit on the ground and listen to talks on sanitation that the nursing staff will give when they come and present. So I had to know a lot of that background.
So when you say the 5 killer diseases, what are you talking about?
Things like measles that we don't think of anymore, or rubella that can be such a big problem. Measles I saw firsthand, for example, in the early 90s when I was there. I had 30 children at one time with measles pneumonia or measles malnutrition, because measles as a virus can affect so many areas of the body, especially the mucosal system. We had a couple of children in one family die with measles pneumonia, and 1 or 2 go blind from measles keratitis. So these sorts of diseases are called killer diseases, but we don't recognize that here and now because we're a generation or 2 generations removed from such. Polio, for example, we were still on the watch for polio when I worked in Zimbabwe, and we had to report any cases of what was called acute flaccid paralysis, when children under the age of 16, if they suddenly became weak, we would have to report, investigate, do all of the cultures to see whether or not it was truly polio or not, and would have to follow that child for 6 to 12 months to ensure that it was not a case of polio, but that it was another viral illness that we're not so much looking for.
So I imagine prior to traveling to Zimbabwe, you were briefed on what to expect. First you landed, I think, in northern Zimbabwe.
Yes.
You were no doubt briefed on what to expect. How did the reality of what you saw on the ground there compare with the briefing you'd received?
Not too far off. Some of the most practical information I received was on what kind of baking tins to bring, and the day-to-day necessities that I might need. Remembering that the voltage was different because it's on the same as the British-based system, and 240 voltage, so everything had to be pre-arranged that way. The Salvation Army very kindly sent along a deep freezer for me with 240 voltage in the packing container. And on the medical side, I wasn't so much briefed except to say that I would be supervised within Zimbabwe for the first 6 months by the chief medical officer at Howard Hospital. That was the first hospital. And I had excellent surgeons who had skills in a broad surgical field, because in Zimbabwe a general practitioner, a family practitioner, is expected to also be able to do surgery to a certain extent in the district hospitals. So I was expected to do cesarean sections, tubal ligations, appendectomy, this sort of thing, which as a general practitioner in Canada we do not do. But again, I believe fortuitously, or God provided, in my time in Corner Brook I did a lot of OR assisting and had gained a fascination for surgery, even within medical school, and gained a proficiency there in assisting and learning to anticipate, so that when I went to Zimbabwe, the 6 months of assessment and training and working for the 4 years in the north of the country with a general surgeon at my side and beck and call enabled me to feel skilled to go by myself to Chelinyamba Hospital later. So.
Tell me about the people of Zimbabwe. What impressed you about the people you met there?
The welcoming spirit, I think. Beautiful, beautiful people, and sharing whatever they had. And of course, that reminds me very much of our own rural Newfoundland and how welcoming people are and how much they're willing to bring you into a family feeling. I felt very safe in the area in which I worked, and even when I was in the far south of the country, people would reassure me, if there's any strife going on anywhere politically, we'll look after you, you're safe. And even the police, who were 4 kilometers away from the hospital, reassured me of the same. So I felt comfortable in the surroundings. And secondly, I think learning the culture and realizing that they appreciated so much my willingness to learn the culture and the language, or both languages, which were the main languages of Zimbabwe, reassured me so much that I was appreciated and loved and missed. Now that I'm back home again, I'm still in contact, and there are a number whom I think of as my children, or I had a share in helping to teach and raise them. So.
Did they show much interest in knowing things about where you came from?
A little bit, but most, even in the rural areas, were pretty well traveled as far as the younger generation was concerned. And sadly, the reason for that was most were traveling across the border looking for work, or going as shoppers and bringing supplies back to resell in Zimbabwe in later years. Zimbabwe itself at one point had become pretty well-to-do in a middle-class kind of setting within the cities as the bread basket of Africa, or sub-Saharan Africa, and had done well in producing and exporting crops, and has a lot of resources in terms of mining. But over the last 10 years that I spent there were political declines and declines in the economy that were worldwidely known, and finding food became more difficult, and people had to cross the border more to get supplies to make a living.
How did you manage in terms of your own personal sustenance? I mean, I don't imagine you could sit down and enjoy Jig's dinner in Zimbabwe. What were your staples? What did you live on?
I could still buy wheat flour and make my own bread. Locally, people were raising chickens, and definitely free range in Zimbabwe. So I had eggs. You could buy milk locally. Cattle were raised within Zimbabwe, so milk was available, and yogurt or lacto, which is almost more of a curdled milk, not quite all the way to cottage cheese, but of that same sort of consistency. And vegetables we could grow whenever we had water pumped to the hospital and to the housing in which we lived. We were able to grow vegetables, so we were a little bit better off, as long as we kept it properly enclosed to keep out the goats. The goats ate everything. And well, it was something you learned to live with and try to protect your own little garden plot from. And local people, I would pay personally to help me raise the vegetables, because I didn't have the time, and also it was good to employ someone else to help me do that. And lived on basics, had purchased usually a month's supply of once a week meat, fish, or chicken. The rest of the time it was peanut butter, local, because that was produced. Peanuts were easily grown, and beans and lentils were locally grown within the country. So I did very well, probably lived more healthily than some here.
It sounds pretty healthy to me, actually. Yes. Now, you were put in charge of I think it was a 130-bed hospital?
100.
100-bed hospital, okay, close.
Yes, pretty good.
But that seems so daunting to me. Talk about the help you had in running the hospital. You must have had a staff.
Oh, yes. Yeah. We had about 30 nurses, and really and truly, they did most of the work within the hospital for the patients. We had about 30 or 40 of those beds reserved for maternity because some seasons of the year were busier than others. A lot of the women had partners in South Africa or Botswana working, and they often were not home except once a year. Usually around Christmas time, all of the industries shut down for 10 days. So somewhere around about September, August, September was going to be busy the next year for deliveries. The nurse midwives did most of the deliveries. They didn't have to call me for most of them, but for about 5% I would have to do a cesarean section or do what would be called instrumental delivery, a vacuum or forceps delivery. Some of the nurses were quite capable of doing the occasional vacuum extraction or delivered twins. And again, our low rates of instrumental deliveries were because usually women were younger, sad to say, fitter than a lot of our population here. And we were usually able to have a normal delivery. And also there was a different ratio of numbers of babies being born, because here people are having maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 children, whereas in Zimbabwe at the time I went, people were quite often pushing for at least 4, because there's no social system to keep you going in your old age. You have to depend on family to look after you. So you wanted at least 4 children, because chances were that 50% of your children might die before the age of 5. So you needed enough children, preferably at least 2 boys and 2 girls, hoping that someone along the way would look after you when they became adults and take you into their home when you were too old to work for yourself. So there was a lot of practicality in that thinking, not just the fact that birth control wasn't quite so much available in the earlier years.
I was just wondering about the distances people would have to travel to come to your hospital. How would they get to see you? Would they travel by train or on bicycle, or how?
No trains down to our area. The train runs Harare, Bulawayo, Victoria Falls. But where I was, no train. Buses. Buses usually ran once a day to various areas, to pretty well all of the villages. Bicycle, yes. We had more than one woman in labor coming on the back of a bicycle, or the crossbar of a bicycle, if you can imagine that. Donkey carts were another way that people would come or go from hospital. And more than once, we would send a note with the bus driver to a certain village to say, so-and-so has had her baby, send the donkey cart for her and the baby. And these days now, they've leapfrogged into quite often having cell phones, but at the time when I first went there, communication wasn't easy. Even the landlines, when I went to Chalinyamba, we're still using the hand crank generator within the phone. So any of the housing that required a telephone, if they needed to phone me in the middle of the night, my phone number was 2 short and 1 long. So things changed a lot in 20 years.
Did you ever have to perform some kind of horrendous emergency surgery?
A few times.
Yeah, can you give me an example? I
recall one woman who was stabbed at the point of 6 months pregnancy, and I had to do some abdominal surgery to repair holes in the bowel. And she recovered well and went on to a normal delivery 3 months later. So that was scary at the time, but blessed with good staff.
So a pregnant woman who was stabbed.
Yes.
What happened?
Brother-in-law. It was a little bit of a family altercation. But
my gosh.
yeah. Other times, well, I had to sew a few wounds from a teenager who was bitten and clawed in the neck by a cheetah.
Really?
The villagers had decided to try to scare away or kill a cheetah that had been bothering, of course, the hens and the livestock in the village. And it's probably not a wise idea to corner a cheetah or to encircle it.
Did you encounter any wild animals in your time there?
Only to see them through the vehicle or going on guided safaris within the safari parks.
Yeah.
But at a distance, I was never personally in danger.
Dawn, it's been fascinating talking to you about your time in Zimbabwe. I wish we could go on, but unfortunately we're out of time.
Oh. Okay.
Thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you.
My guest has been Dr. Dawn Howse. See you again next time.
Thank you.